Welcome to this month's health conversation, being recorded in February, the month of the year when we see the lowest level of vitamin D in the whole population. In fact, up here in Norway, most people have a deficiency around this time of year. Vitamin D is involved in many parts of our health, and today Erik-Alexander and I will point them out and explain how you achieve optimal levels. So vitamin D is special because our body can make it itself when our skin is exposed to sunlight. But this is rarely enough, and most of us depend on extra vitamin D from our diet, and most of us also need supplements. Now we call it a vitamin, but in fact it's more of a hormone-like function. And most cells in our body has a vitamin D receptor, meaning vitamin D is involved in almost every cell in our body. And we now see more and more associations to different parts of our health and vitamin D. Because it's well known that vitamin D is important for our bones and our muscle health. But we now also see its significance to our vascular health and our blood sugar regulation. We also see many studies linking it to our cognitive function, our brain, as well as our gut health and our gut function. We need vitamin D to absorb many nutrients. Vitamin D is important for our muscles and our muscle function, and it affects our balance, which is why this time of year is when we see the most number of accidents related to fall and fractures. From a regulatory perspective, the European Food Safety Authorities has evaluated the evidence and approved specific health claims related to vitamin D. Now, these claims are important because they reflect a high standard of scientific evidence. EFSA is very conservative when it comes to allowing claims, which is why it's important how vitamin D is recognized as supporting bones, muscle, immune, and cellular function, reinforcing how its impact on our health is broader rather than just narrow to our bone health. Despite this, as I mentioned at the beginning of this health conversation, deficiency is common. In fact, most of us will experience a deficiency in vitamin D somewhat through our life, or even some parts of the year if we are not careful about the intake. And this is related to the limited exposure to sunlight, especially at winter times when we don't see the sun as much and we also cover up more to stay warm. There are few natural dietary sources of vitamin D, and our modern lifestyle, where we stay a lot inside and we take our car instead of running or walking and taking our bike when we normally would have been exposed to some daylight, this is removed completely from many people's daily life. There are also biological functions that will result in the body being less able to convert the UV lighting to vitamin D, and also absorbing from the diet and utilizing in the body. Unfortunately, the body's ability to utilize vitamin D goes down with age, and if you have a bit of a darker skin with more pigmentation, the conversion to vitamin D will be lower. Also, we now use often high levels of SPF in our sunscreen, and this also affects and slows down the body's ability to make vitamin D. We should still protect our skin, but this is something we need to keep in mind, that it does affect our vitamin D levels. As most other parts of our health, vitamin D does not work alone, and we see a synergy effect with vitamin D, vitamin K2, magnesium, calcium, and also other minerals. And I'm going to give you one example. We need magnesium to activate vitamin D, and we need the active form of vitamin D to absorb magnesium. So can you see what happens and how the whole system gets disturbed when we lack one or the other? So now Erik-Alexander Richter will take a closer look at vitamin D and our immune response in combination with omega-3.
Hi Carine, thank you for the introduction, and let me elaborate a little bit more about this famous vitamin D3. Here you see a whole sheet full of problems, like signs of deficiency, like muscle weakness, malformation of bones, osteomalacia. That's like if you tap on your chest here, and it like really hurts. Rickets, when the bones are bent. Insomnia, like you have sleepless nights. Cognitive impairment, and maybe myopia it's called. That's things problem with the eyes. And then we have causes of the deficiency. Why are some people short? Maybe you're just living inside, it's too cold outside, or I don't know, maybe you just like your indoor lifestyle. You can have metabolic abnormalities, like you do not absorb well because you do not eat enough fat, or your gallbladder or your liver is not working well. If you go outside, maybe you always use a sunblock, or your stomach acid may not be good. There's a lot of reasons why you could be short. So having an indoor lifestyle definitely is not the best. When I was a kid, we were always outside playing in the sun, even get an occasional sunburn, which is not recommended, by the way. But if you eat healthy, you can kind of deal with it. My mom never ran after me with the sunscreen or stuff like that. Okay, maybe when we went to Italy from the Netherlands, so that's a difference, but not in our own country. She just said, just don't get burned. That's it. So how do you get burned? Of course, if you live somewhere where it's not the match for the right sun. You could say like that, right? This left lady here, she is from Brazil, so she can likely handle a lot of sun. Type 3 skin type, and that gets even darker if you go more down to the equator or more to the Africans. On the right side, you see the lady probably coming from Scotland with a very fair skin, because there is not that much skin in the north of Europe. So to make sure she adapts to the region, her skin is very fair, like the type 1. So you have to adapt. If she goes on a holiday in Brazil or the other way around, then of course she might get a sunburn, and the other lady may be short in D3 in Scotland, since it's mostly raining up there. So we have to pay attention for that kind of topic. So what happens actually if we get the sun in our skin? Our skin is rich in cholesterol, and to be honest, it's like a precursor of cholesterol, but let's keep it not too complicated. So the sun gets into the skin, reaches this specific type of cholesterol, and it starts to build up a vitamin B pre-D3, cholecalciferol. You convert to D3, and then you take the vitamin D binding protein, and the same happens if it comes from the diet, and then it moves to the bloodstream, to the liver. And now it will be converted in a different type. We call this the 25-OH-D3. That's actually what you're testing. You just, Carine, you mentioned this by the test we do. That's the one we test, the 25-OH-D3. But to be able to measure this 25-OH, you need to have magnesium, like from the Nordic Energy Booster. There's many more nutrients in there, but protect your skin and helps to convert the D3 into 25-OH-D3. Once this one needs to go in full active form, then it goes to the kidneys, have another conversion, and then it is the most active form. But that's a little technical, so we'll leave that away. So when is this working? Like this lady here is running along the beach, but quite likely in the evening, which is nicer for running. But do you build up vitamin D3? Well, that's the question, because this is where you have to pay attention for. If you're outside, let's just put this guy on the beach too, but let's say you're just outside, and this guy is 1.80 meters tall, then he has to check the length of his shadow. If that's longer than 180, then likely the sun is quite low in the sky. So it hits too much of the ozone layer, and like all the UV B light will be filtered out. And that's the necessary light you need for building up D3. Once the sun gets higher, gets a more bright color, now the passing to the ozone layer is more straight, and now you hit the skin intensive, the shadow is shorter, and now you build up the D3. Okay, and you'll get the UVA light as well. And once that happens, again, we convert into the 25-OH and we bring it into the kidneys and go on. So I always use the sun if available, but every single day I use, like in my personal preference is the gold, and I take the K2 D3 along with that, well, that's already something nice. But those who don't do stuff like that likely will be deficient. If you're in wintertime and you're living like in the middle and north of Europe and you're not taking any D3, you belong to this category where 95% of the people are short in D3. I'm not saying the intake, I'm saying the measurement in the blood. Okay, so this really is not good. People don't meet the recommendations. But the challenge is that the recommendations also will not bring us into this at least non-sufficient level, let alone the optimum level. That's a different story completely. So we know 95% is short. So what is short? If you are severe deficient, I mean, that's dangerous, okay? We see people here, 25 nanomoles or 10 nanograms. That's about the conversion is 2.5 to 1. If those people start to take the RDA, they will always remain in that level. They'll never build up. Okay, maybe it doesn't get worse, but at least it's not getting better. You need a very high dosage. That's again taking the D3 in the oil for the best absorption. You're still deficient anyone being up to 50 and below, okay, or 10 to 20 nanograms per ml, depending on the country. So here you're still deficient. You're still low deficient between 50, 75 or 20 and 30. And the normal values, not even the optimal value, but the normal values start to happen at 75 or 30 on this side. Now let's check what is the best level. And this depends a little bit on what else you do. If you would purely take the D3, don't go bananas. But if you add the D3, the K2 and the magnesium, now you're way more safe. So now you can see the optimal level actually starts at 125 up to 175 nanomoles, or even maybe even 200 if you like so. But that's like the values we use for treatments. That's not the business of ecology, okay? So if you can live in between the 125 and the 175, most of this risk for all kinds of funny diseases just vanish, okay? That's what you like. And of course, the other value is between 50 and 70 nanograms. And don't get here. Nothing will happen for maybe a year, okay? And it will lower by itself, but just don't go there. It's not needed, okay? Don't go anywhere above 250 micrograms a day. I'll show you why. So how much research is there on all these kind of diseases we can prevent by taking enough? That's 113,038 studies today, as in the end of January 26th, the day of this recording. It is an endless list of research. And it goes all the way back to 1922. That's when we figured out the sanatoria in Switzerland helped a lot for kids with a deficiency, like those with tuberculosis or those with rickets or lung diseases, all kinds of, and they were put here in these buildings and then enjoyed the sunlight and had great benefit from it. And they just thought it was the clean air, but then they figured out it's the sun and the buildup of it, but that came only much later. So this study already is old. It's like over 100 years ago. At that time, you had a lot of industry and in the big cities and everybody was heating their homes with coal or with wood. So there was a lot of smog, and these kids, maybe even if they would play outside, they still would be deficient because the sun couldn't penetrate these big, thick clouds of pollution. Okay, so that was not too good. Today we don't see this that much anymore, but we're still the deficiency. Now you can see it in the development of the jaw or the chest, which is too flat, and more things like that, or just breakable bones. So if the jaw is not developing well, now you can see that maybe in the beginning it's okay. This kid maybe do not have rickets, but the low levels of D3 will have an effect on age-related disease for his little future. So the D3 is again important for maybe 1,000 different functions. So you want to start good, then you should start even before pregnancy and having the optimum value for the mom And then this kid maybe could become 142 years and not too bad of a health. But why is it more kids today are still suffering from rickets? It was like a disease from the early days, like 100 years ago and longer. Now, once we figured out how efficient this D3 was and kids went outside and on the beach and we didn't use any sunscreen, the values they could take was like maybe 5,000 units. They would take the cod liver oil in the winter, very rich in D3, and that was okay. And then in the summer they would play outside. But today, like in 2008, there was a readjustment of the value. It went from 5,000 down to 400 to 600 units, which is very low, which is 10 to 15 micrograms. And it hasn't been changed yet, or it hasn't been changed since, I should say, and it should be changed. And why is that? Because here's the question mark here. Something went wrong in 2016. There was a major study was done, and this person here is writing about this big D3 mistake. This big study was done, and they figured out that we don't need that much, just to make sure they do not have rickets. 400 to 600 units a day is sufficient. Let's lower this level. No need for it. But they took away a big part of their health. For example, they figured out in Finland, when they had that higher doses, then they almost completely eliminated diabetes type 1 with children. But as soon as this value was introduced, the children start to get diabetes type 1 again, because it's very preventative for autoimmune diseases, for bone diseases, for all kinds of genetic diseases, immune system, autoimmune disease, all that kind of stuff. So they figured out that that's okay for the bones, but not enough, because we have the nuclear receptor activating hormones as well. That means it goes all the way into the DNA and activates something there. And to be sure that levels can do what it needs to do, we should stay at least in the 75 to 100 and higher, okay, nanomoles. So 100 nanomoles is 40 nanograms. So that's where the real good stuff starts to happen. So this is a study they did with many women, and they checked out. It was a study over several years, but of course someday the kids stopped taking breast milk, okay, and they checked the intake for the mother and then the D3 supplementation during lactation, and also what happens with the child. Okay, they compared the intake from the mom with the child. Now, in the beginning, they figured out that if you give the mom 400 units a day and the child 400 units a day, it's not building up very well. And so the 400 is by far not enough for the mom. It's reasonable for the kid. It's better than nothing. Most kids today don't get anything at all. But once they start to give the mom not 400, but 6,400 international units, yeah, that's 160 micrograms, okay? Once the mothers were taking that, then the level of this D3 in the blood and therefore in the breast milk went up significantly. That's the green bar. So you can see a massive increase versus only giving the kid 400 units and the mom 400 units. So it's like nearly double the value, and that's what we want. So on average, I normally say make sure the mother has 125 nanomoles or higher during the entire pregnancy, reduces the risk for all kinds of diseases in the future. Plus, you can be sure there is D3 in the breast milk. And it's the same for top sports people. They need the same. And let's compare it to something else, even before the child is born. If you check the quality of sperm cells, you can also see the need for the vitamin D3 and that part. For example, here, if you produce a sperm cell, that takes several months before they're really ready for delivery, okay? So that's a whole development state. But if the health span of the lifestyle of the quality of the lifestyle of the man is not good, then likely this DNA will be damaged. We call this the DNA fragmentation index, and that should be absolutely below 15. But this is, you can see there is participants who had a much higher than 15%. So that means single strand breaks, and therefore the offspring will not be as healthy, or there will not be any pregnancy at all. So they used an antioxidant therapy, they used multivitamins like the energy booster, they used the coenzyme Q10 like in the heart and energy, combined with omega-3, and the oligoelements are also in the Nordic energy booster. And of course you need the D3, we just learned that before. And if you do not do that, what you experience is that young boys or men, they already may have too much of a fragmentation index in the DNA. Maybe they have the telephone in the pocket with radiation. Maybe they are sufficient in D3 or an omega-3 or anything like that. But it is only getting worse once we get older. Okay, his dad might have 25%. So the study showed that if you give the right intervention with all these antioxidants and omega-3s and all that, then this fragmentation index seriously came down. But remember, it should never be anything above 15%. And here's something interesting. Now they compare it with the levels of vitamin D3. And you can see this is the 15% line. And then it hits this line here. And this line depends on the amount of the serum vitamin D in nanograms per ml or in nanomoles. I added these values. So you can see you need to be at 55 nanograms or maybe 125 nanomoles roughly to, on average, get your D3 levels with the fragmentation index below 15. And you can see it even gets better if you raise the dosage. So it's very likely it will be safe to have a higher dosage. Now we know 125 for sure is a very solid level you can have. But I think even growing it up a little higher to 175 might be better. So here you can see, because some people will say, and especially doctors and medical people say, oh, no, don't do that. You get kidney stones, you get calcifications of whatever tissues in the body. But they did this study and they checked the range between 20 and 100 nanograms of 50 to 250 nanomoles. That's what I put in there. And then they checked for kidney stones. And they actually found that lower levels of D3 with an unhealthy lifestyle were much more likely to produce kidney stones than a higher level of D3, and especially with a healthier body. So these concentrations you have to check, you have to measure, the test as Carine told you. Make sure you test and you get this optimum level. And if you cannot test for whatever reason, at least go to the 4,000 international units or 100 micrograms for anyone 9 years and older. 4,000 units, that's what they recommend. We cannot recommend that. Ecology cannot recommend it because that's not an EFSA thing. You're not allowed to do it. But it's just to make sure you can be safe even in the higher intakes. Okay, so 400 units or 100 micrograms is typically associated with a level of somewhere between 100 and 150. And that's okay. But there is a difference between small people, big people, old, young, more fat, and so on. That's the difference. So just to make sure you know it's safe to do so. Okay, so when is the D3 level the lowest? That's always in the winter months. We know that if you do not take the supplement. That's why I always take the supplements all year around, but in the winter months I add extra. I take the regular vitamin D3 bottle and I add it into the bottle of oil just to make sure I stay within the optimum levels. Because what I don't like is if these levels are very low, that on average the levels of flu activity is very high. It's proven over and over again. These are records from a long time ago until now. Even in 2017 they checked, and if you have levels above 65 compared below, you have a lower risk of 42% of any respiratory infection. So yes, it works as a prevention. It's not to cure the flu, it is to prevent you get any respiratory infections like the flu. Many books are written. A very famous guy, Malcolm, did many, the UV advantage, getting sunlight in the skin, or the vitamin D solution. I think I have some like these here. This is another one, the vitamin D cure. That's also a medical book for all kinds of diseases, which is not the thing what we do. but the importance of the sun and cholesterol and D3, it's all linked together. So the rhetorical myth is avoid sun, that's the best, and the more sun, the worse it gets, the higher is the risk. But the reality, it's entirely different. No sun is very dangerous for blood pressure, low D3, and many more. And then this is the optimum, and don't get sunburns, okay? So here, this is dangerous, but this middle here is sufficient. And still take your K2, D3, magnesium to make sure everything works well. So there is a vitamin D3 solution in the sun. Don't get a sunburn. Still take your supplements and double them in the wintertime. That's what I do, and that works pretty well for me. Thank you very much, and back to you, Carine.
Thank you, Erik-Alexander. I always learn something new when listening to you. So how do we secure that we get enough vitamin D? Now, we do know that very few of us get enough from the sun and the diet, so most of us will depend on supplements. And in fact, supplementation of vitamin D is recommended from the health authorities, especially during winter time. But the optimal dosage of vitamin D actually varies a lot from one person to the next. And it depends on time of year and geography, age, lifestyle, skin pigmentation, etc. Therefore, we see the correct dosage can vary from 10 microgram to 80 microgram. And over the years, the recommended amount of vitamin D has increased quite a lot. In fact, when I was in school, I learned that 5 micrograms a day was sufficient. And then we increased to 10, then to 20, then to 40, and so on. The maximum dosage recommended today is 80 micrograms. But you can sometimes experience your doctor recommending even a higher level of vitamin D, especially for a certain amount of time. And if you are in that group, listen to your doctor and always consult. This is why it's so important that we do test our vitamin D levels, because it will vary. It's hard to know only from taking a supplement to know if we actually achieve a sufficient amount and an optimal level in our body. And I will highly recommend that you do test your vitamin D levels throughout the year, because your status will vary from summertime to wintertime. And now it's February, so please test your vitamin D levels, as most people who do not take a supplement, even people who do take a supplement, will even have quite low levels. So the importance of testing, test, don't guess, throughout the year.